Imagine being a Kuwaiti soldier on Bubiyan Island back in May, patrolling a stretch of coastline most people outside the Gulf have never heard of, when you run into an armed infiltration team that has no business being on your soil. That firefight actually happened. 4 operatives linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard were captured, 1 Kuwaiti soldier was wounded, and Iran denied the whole thing was ever a hostile act. That single verified incident back in May is the seed of a story that has now grown into something much bigger and much louder. And as of this week, it involves a sitting former Iranian foreign minister openly talking about taking American troops hostage. So today, Thursday, July 23rd, 2026, I want to walk you through exactly what Iran has actually threatened when it comes to invading Kuwait, separate that from the rhetoric, and then show you precisely what the United States military has now unleashed in response, because the scale of the American buildup happening right now is honestly staggering once you see it laid out together. I want to set the stage for why this particular threat cuts differently than most of the rhetoric we've heard throughout this war. This is a conflict that's been running since February 28th, and over those 5 months we've heard an enormous amount of hardline Iranian rhetoric. Threats against Israel, threats against American bases broadly, threats to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Most of it stayed fairly abstract, aimed at deterrence rather than describing a specific plan against a specific country. What's different about the last several days is the specificity, named bases, a named number of hostages, an explicit historical reference to the 1979 embassy seizure, coming not from anonymous social media accounts, but from a former cabinet minister and a sitting advisor to Iran's supreme leader. That shift from vague threats to specific ones is exactly why this story jumped from a regional worry to a story getting covered by outlets across the world within days. Let's start with why Kuwait specifically. Gulf strategists have long called Kuwait an unsinkable aircraft carrier for American power projection into Iraq and the wider region. It hosts 3 major American installations, Camp Bering, Camp Arifjan, and Ali al-Salem Air Base, and it does not share a land border with Iran, which historically made it feel like a safer rear base than somewhere like Bahrain, home to the entire U.S. Fifth Fleet. But Kuwait carries a scar that makes any invasion talk land differently there than almost anywhere else in the Gulf. It was itself invaded and occupied by Saddam Hussein's Iraq back in 1990, an occupation that only ended after a massive American-led coalition drove Iraqi forces out. So, when Iranian officials start talking openly about ground incursions into Kuwaiti territory, that's not an abstract threat to Kuwaitis. That's a memory. Now let's build the actual timeline, because I think it's important you see how this escalated step by step, rather than assuming it appeared out of nowhere this week. Back in May, that Bubiyan Island infiltration attempt happened. 4 IRGC-linked operatives captured, 1 Kuwaiti soldier wounded. Iran denied it constituted a hostile act. Kuwaiti authorities separately said in May that they'd arrested several Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers who allegedly tried to infiltrate the country by fishing boat to carry out what was described as hostile actions, something Iran also denied. That's 2 separate infiltration-related incidents involving IRGC personnel on or near Kuwaiti territory within the same month, both denied by Tehran, both handled quietly by Kuwaiti security forces without turning into a larger incident at the time. Bubiyan Island itself is worth understanding a little better too. It's actually Kuwait's largest island, roughly 863 square kilometers, sitting at the northern end of the Persian Gulf close to the Iraqi border. And it anchors a major Kuwaiti port development project, which is exactly why any repeat infiltration attempt there represents a direct threat to regional maritime commerce, not just a symbolic border violation. Then the rhetoric started catching up to the reality. On July 19th, Mahdi Khanalzadeh, an Iranian international relations analyst who has previously argued on Iranian state television that American bases across the region are legitimate targets, said publicly that Kuwait is considered one of Iran's principal options for a potential ground incursion aimed at seizing the 2 American military bases inside the country. His comments landed alongside remarks from Manucher Mottaki, Iran's foreign minister from 2005 to 2010, and a current sitting member of parliament, who said in an interview broadcast on Iranian state media that Iran should launch a ground war, infiltrate and seize an American military base in the Middle East, and take thousands of American military personnel hostage. Mottaki went even further in later remarks, explicitly proposing the capture of roughly 100 American service members to be transported back into Iranian territory as prisoners for future leverage, language that deliberately echoes the 1979 Tehran embassy seizure, when Iranian students held American diplomats hostage for 444 days. That's not a subtle historical reference. That's Iran's own political class explicitly invoking one of the most defining hostage crises in modern American history as a strategic playbook. Mottaki's comments carried one important qualifier, though, that I don't want to gloss over because accuracy matters here. He conditioned this specifically on the United States seizing Iranian territory first, citing Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, as the trigger. He said if Washington seizes Iranian territory like that, Iran would then claim the right to invade what he called American territory, meaning the American bases inside Kuwait. So this isn't presented, even by its own advocates, as an unconditional plan. It's framed as retaliatory escalation contingent on the U.S. taking a specific action first. Separately, advisor to Iran's Supreme Leader Mohsen Rezai delivered his own ultimatum around the same time, warning on social media that if America continues the war for another 2 to 3 days, Iran would enter what he called the stage of the enemy's full-scale invasion and annihilation, adding that Iran would no longer settle for retaliation in kind and that, quote, no political border will provide security against Iran's offensive forces, end quote. Iranian Member of Parliament Ahmad Bakhshash Ardestani added his own version of this argument just this week, saying Tehran could launch ground attacks on both Kuwait and Bahrain, specifically if the United States invaded Iranian territory, while separately claiming that Iranian missiles from Semnan, Zahedan, and Isfahan could reach and threaten Karg Island even if American forces briefly occupied it. So here's where I want to be very direct with you, because I don't want to mislead anyone watching this video. No official Iranian invasion order has been publicly confirmed. There is no verified report of Iranian ground forces actually beginning such an operation against Kuwait. What has happened is a cluster of increasingly open, increasingly specific statements from senior and influential Iranian voices, a former foreign minister, a supreme leader advisor, sitting members of parliament, discussing this openly on state media and social platforms. Independent defense analysts who've studied this closely describe a large-scale Iranian ground seizure of hardened American installations as operationally improbable, given Iran's lack of the amphibious or overland logistics needed to sustain a contested assault against a defended Gulf state. Any Iranian ground movement toward Camp Buering, Camp Arifjan, or Ali al-Salam would almost certainly require transiting through Iraqi territory or executing a seaborne assault across the northern Gulf, both of which would expose Iranian forces to Kuwaiti coastal radar, American satellite surveillance, and rapid coalition interdiction long before they got anywhere near an actual base. The failed Bubiyan infiltration back in May is really the only verified instance of Iranian personnel physically crossing into Kuwaiti claimed territory during this entire war, and that attempt ended with 4 operatives captured and 1 Kuwaiti soldier wounded. Not exactly evidence of a force capable of executing a serious, sustained ground campaign. Let's break down exactly why the logistics don't add up, because I think that's more convincing than just quoting an analyst's conclusion. A real amphibious assault requires purpose-built landing craft, sustained air cover over the beachhead, naval gunfire support to suppress defenders, and enough follow-on troops and supplies crossing the water continuously to actually hold ground once you've taken it, not just briefly occupy it. Iran's Navy and IRGC naval forces are built almost entirely around small, fast attack boats designed for hit and run harassment of tankers and quick coastal strikes, not for sustaining a contested crossing against a defended shoreline backed by Patriot batteries and American radar coverage. And the overland option through Iraq carries its own massive problem. It would require either Baghdad's tacit cooperation, which seems extremely unlikely given Iraq's own precarious balancing act between Washington and Tehran, or an outright violation of Iraqi sovereignty that would instantly create a second active warfront for Iran on top of everything it's already fighting. Neither path looks remotely close to something Iran could execute quickly or quietly, which is exactly why most serious military analysts read this rhetoric as coercive signaling aimed at deterrence and domestic messaging, rather than an actual operational plan sitting on someone's desk in Tehran ready to be executed. But here's the thing, even rhetoric that's operationally improbable still forces a response, because you don't get to bet an entire nation's security on your own confident assessment of what the other side probably can't pull off. And that's exactly where the American response comes in, because what's actually been unleashed here in terms of hardware, platforms, and posture is enormous. Start with the carriers, because this is the part that I think gets underappreciated. The United States currently has what analysts are calling a rare tri-carrier deployment concentrated across the broader theater, spanning the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most advanced carrier in the American fleet, equipped with the electromagnetic aircraft launch system instead of traditional steam catapults, giving it a significantly higher sortie generation rate than older Nimitz-class carriers, is operating alongside the USS Abraham Lincoln, while the USS George H.W. Bush has also been moving into theater. 3 full carrier strike groups operating in the same broad region at the same time is the kind of posture typically associated with major contingency planning, not routine presence. That's not a subtle signal. That's the United States Navy telling Tehran, in the most expensive language available, that it's prepared for rapid escalation on multiple fronts simultaneously if this situation worsens. Think about what a single carrier strike group actually represents for a second. because the number 3 in front of it is easy to say and much harder to actually picture. Each carrier doesn't travel alone. It's the centerpiece of a strike group that typically includes multiple guided missile destroyers and cruisers, an attack submarine, a supply ship, and somewhere around 75 aircraft on the flight deck alone. Fighters, electronic warfare aircraft, early warning planes, and helicopters. Multiply that by 3, spread across 3 different maritime corridors simultaneously, and you're looking at a combined force that can independently generate strike sorties, missile defense coverage, and maritime interdiction capability in 3 separate regional crises at once without any single carrier group needing to redeploy from wherever it currently sits. That's the kind of flexibility that lets Washington respond to an Iranian move against Kuwait, a Houthi escalation in the Red Sea, or a flare-up somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, without having to choose which crisis gets naval coverage and which one waits. In the air, the buildup has been just as aggressive. The United States has deployed F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-35 Lightning IIs, and F-22 Raptors into the Central Command area of responsibility. And according to a U.S. official who spoke to Reuters, the Pentagon had already begun moving additional fighter jets and refueling tankers into the Middle East, even before the deadly July 17th attack in Jordan that killed American troops, confirming reporting that had circulated days earlier. After that attack, the pace accelerated further with additional F-16s and F-35s moving in from bases in Europe alongside more aerial refueling tankers. The kind of quiet, unglamorous asset that determines how far and how long American strike aircraft can actually operate before needing to return to base. On the ground and air defense side, specifically protecting Kuwait and its neighbors, the posture includes Patriot missile batteries deployed throughout Kuwait for the entire duration of this conflict, along with THAAD systems, terminal high altitude area defense positioned at key regional bases, including in Jordan. And this isn't a passive shield either. It's been actively engaged night after night. Kuwait's military has repeatedly reported its air defenses intercepting hostile drone and missile threats. And just in this most recent 48-hour window, Kuwait's armed forces said its systems were responding to hostile drone threats yet again, while Jordan's official news agency reported its air defenses downed 3 Iranian missiles and 6 drones over a single recent 24-hour period, with 1 missile that wasn't intercepted landing in a remote, uninhabited area. Now let's talk about what just happened in the last 24 hours, because this is about as current as this story gets. Central Command announced it completed its 12th consecutive night of strikes against Iran late Wednesday, targeting Iranian military infrastructure including maritime capabilities, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and air defense assets, with Central Command stating the strikes further degrade Iran's ability to attack civilian mariners and commercial vessels. Central Command also said it has targeted dozens of Iranian military sites on land just this month alone, while continuing to enforce the naval blockade against Iran following the collapse of an earlier 14-point ceasefire framework, and confirmed it has redirected 9 commercial vessels and disabled 1 to prevent ships from entering or departing Iranian ports. 12 consecutive nights is worth pausing on for a second, because that's not a one-time punitive strike, that's an entire month approaching of continuous nightly combat operations, night after night after night, which tells you this has fully shifted from a limited retaliatory action into a sustained war of attrition aimed at grinding down Iran's capability piece by piece, rather than trying to end things in one dramatic blow. Iran hit back within hours. The IRGC and Iran's regular army carried out retaliatory strikes on Thursday, targeting American military facilities in both Kuwait and Jordan. And Tehran claimed, specifically, the destruction of a Patriot air defense system and an MQ-9 Reaper drone depot inside Kuwait, along with a THAAD radar system in Jordan. Iran's army separately claimed it fired surface-to-surface missiles at American HIMARS rocket systems stationed at Camp Arifjan. The IRGC described these attacks explicitly as retaliation against the United States, not against the Kuwaiti or Jordanian people. An important distinction Tehran has been careful to draw throughout this conflict, likely an attempt to avoid turning every single Gulf state into a direct, permanent enemy. Now, I want to flag something important here, because it matters for keeping this video accurate. None of Iran's claimed destruction at Camp Arifjan, the Patriot system, the drone depot, the THAAD radar, has been independently confirmed as of this recording. Kuwaiti authorities, for their part, did not report new damage to civilian infrastructure in that same window, and their own statement described the explosions heard across the country as the result of successful interceptions, not successful Iranian hits. So you're getting 2 very different pictures depending on which government's press release you read, and I'd rather show you both sides of that gap honestly than just repeat whichever claim sounds more dramatic. This is actually a pattern that's repeated itself constantly throughout this entire war, and it's worth naming directly because it'll help you evaluate every future headline coming out of this conflict too. Iran's state-aligned media consistently reports major successful strikes against American assets, destroyed Patriot batteries, downed fighter jets, damaged command centers, while the American and Kuwaiti side consistently reports successful interceptions and minimal or no confirmed damage. Both sides have obvious incentives here. Iran needs to show its own domestic audience and its remaining regional allies that it's inflicting real damage on American forces, despite 12 straight nights of being on the receiving end of strikes, while the United States and its Gulf partners have their own incentive to project confidence and capability rather than acknowledge vulnerabilities in their air defense networks. The honest answer, almost every single time this pattern repeats, is that the truth sits somewhere in between. Some Iranian fire likely does occasionally get through, given the sheer volume being launched night after night. But the wholesale destruction of major systems, like an entire Patriot battery or a THAAD radar that Iran claims almost nightly at this point, simply hasn't held up to independent scrutiny in the vast majority of previous instances throughout this war. While all of that was happening on the battlefield, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was fielding questions at the ASEAN summit in Manila, and when asked directly whether the United States was planning to escalate its ongoing strike campaign in the coming days, he didn't hedge. He said Iran is, quote, going to pay a price, end quote, and added, quote, the president's policy is a head for an eye, end quote, before saying, quote, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing, end quote. That head for an eye phrasing is worth sitting with for a second because it's a deliberate escalation of the more familiar eye for an eye framing, suggesting the administration's stated posture isn't proportional retaliation, it's retaliation that intentionally outweighs whatever Iran does first. There's also a piece of this story that doesn't get talked about enough, and it explains a lot about why Kuwait specifically has become such a soft target for Iran throughout this war. Early in the conflict, back in March, 3 American F-15E fighter jets were shot down over Kuwait in what the U.S. military officially called an apparent friendly fire incident, not an Iranian success. A reminder that even without enemy action, the sheer density of aircraft, air defense systems, and interceptors now operating over a small country like Kuwait carries its own serious risks. And Kuwait's geography creates an additional complication that most people don't think about. Because of its proximity to Iraq, the country has also had to deal with drone threats launched by Iranian-aligned Shia militias operating out of Iraqi territory, layering an extra threat vector on top of direct Iranian missile and drone fire coming across the Gulf. That means Kuwait's air defense network isn't just tracking one direction of threat. It's simultaneously watching its Gulf approaches for Iranian fire and its northern border with Iraq for militia-launched drones, a genuinely difficult defensive picture for a country roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. Kuwait has also been repeatedly clear on the diplomatic front that it has not authorized its territory to be used to launch offensive action against Iran, a distinction Kuwaiti officials keep drawing publicly, essentially trying to preserve its position as a defensive host rather than an active combatant, even while hosting the exact American bases that keep coming under fire. You made it to the roundup section, so let's touch on a few other angles moving in parallel right now. The Gulf Cooperation Council's Secretary General has accused Iran of war crimes over attacks on civilian infrastructure across the region, a serious diplomatic escalation in its own right, given that the GCC represents Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Oman, collectively, essentially the entire bloc of Gulf Arab states, standing together on the accusation rather than Kuwait facing this alone. And Kuwait's own vulnerability runs deeper than military hardware. Roughly 90% of the country's drinking water comes from desalination plants, meaning a sustained campaign against that infrastructure specifically threatens something far more basic and far more devastating for ordinary Kuwaiti civilians than any base or radar system, which is exactly why earlier Iranian strikes on Kuwaiti desalination and power facilities drew such sharp condemnation from Gulf officials. Think about that for a second. A country of roughly 4.5 million people, the overwhelming majority of whom rely on machinery, not rainfall or rivers, for the water coming out of their taps every single day, and that machinery has already been a confirmed target earlier in this conflict. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, Iran hasn't fully shut the door on talks. Iranian Interior Minister Eskandar Momeni traveled to Pakistan this week, where his Pakistani counterpart greeted him by saying he hoped Momeni had, quote, brought good news, end quote. And Iran's foreign ministry has acknowledged that regional mediators sent Tehran additional proposals even in the middle of continued hostilities. So even with all of this invasion rhetoric and nightly strikes, there's still a quiet diplomatic channel running in parallel, which tells you Tehran hasn't fully committed to the maximalist path some of its own officials are publicly describing. It's a genuinely strange dynamic when you sit with it. The same government whose advisors are publicly threatening to take American hostages and invade a neighboring country is simultaneously sending its interior minister abroad hoping for good news on a negotiated settlement. And that contradiction itself tells you something important. Iran's own leadership doesn't appear to be speaking with one unified voice. on how this war should end, or even on how far they're willing to escalate it in the meantime. So let's pull this together, because I think the honest answer here is more nuanced than either headline you could write about this story. Is Iran seriously planning and preparing an imminent ground invasion of Kuwait right now, capable of actually seizing Camp Buering, Camp Arifjan, or Ali al-Salim? Based on everything independently verifiable that looks operationally improbable, Iran simply doesn't appear to have the logistical depth, the naval lift capacity, or a viable overland route that wouldn't be detected and interdicted long before Iranian forces got anywhere close. The only actual, confirmed physical incursion attempt back in May on Bubiyan Island failed within a single firefight. But is the rhetoric itself, coming from a former foreign minister, a supreme leader advisor, and sitting members of parliament, meaningless just because the capability gap is real? I don't think so either, because rhetoric like this shapes deterrence calculations in real time, regardless of whether it's ever executed. And it's exactly the kind of talk that justifies, in the eyes of American planners, a response as overwhelming as 3 simultaneous carrier strike groups, a surge of 5th-generation fighters, THAAD and Patriot batteries stacked across multiple Gulf states, and 12 consecutive nights of strikes aimed at systematically degrading whatever capability Iran might eventually try to use, whether that's a ground incursion, a missile barrage, or some combination of both. There's a broader lesson buried in this specific story too, one that applies well beyond just Kuwait. Wars like this one don't usually escalate through some single dramatic decision, a president waking up one morning and ordering an invasion. They tend to escalate through exactly this kind of incremental pattern, an infiltration attempt here, an inflammatory interview there, a hostage-taking proposal from a former official who technically doesn't speak for the government, but absolutely shapes what the government's actual options look like once that idea is out in public. Every one of those individual moments looks survivable and containable in isolation. Stacked together over 5 months of continuous conflict, they add up to a Gulf region now hosting 3 American carrier strike groups, THAAD batteries in multiple countries, and a genuine publicly discussed possibility of American service members being taken hostage on foreign soil for the first time since 1979. That's the trajectory worth watching closely, not because any single headline this week proves an invasion is imminent, but because the cumulative direction of travel over these past several months has been consistently toward more escalation, not less, regardless of how many quiet diplomatic channels stay open in the background. What do you think happens from here? Do you think Iran's leadership is seriously weighing an actual ground operation into Kuwait, or is this a calculated pressure campaign designed purely to rattle Gulf partners and test how far American and allied forces are willing to stretch their defenses across multiple fronts at once? Let me know what you think in the comments. I genuinely read through them. And if you want the deeper breakdowns like this one, the platforms, the postures, the parts of this war that don't always make the headline, I put that together every week over at Max Burner Energy. Completely free to join. Thanks for spending this time with me.